Also, as a reminder, for more Microsoft Webcasts, you can visit microsoft.com/webcasts. And again, I'd like to welcome everyone to today's Msdn Geekspeak webcast, Workflow Foundation Rules and Policies with Mark Dunn. And now, without any further delay, I'm going to turn the floor over to today's first presenter, Glenn Gordon.
Thanks very much. Hey, everyone out there in Geekspeak land. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Geekspeak. It's the webcast series where you get to ask questions of the experts that we bring on. So in this installation, we're going to be covering a lot of cool stuff around Workflow Foundation, which we'll get to in a bit. But my name is Glenn Gordon. I am one of the hosts. I am part of the Msdn events team that presents Msdn events live around the country. And my co-presenter on the Geekspeak series is Lynn Langett. Lynn, how are things out in Southern California today?
Hey, Glenn. It's good to have you back on. Between vacations and everything else, we've kind of missed you. Things are fine. Busy, but things are fine.
Yeah, we've been having a couple of guest hosts here and there, so you'll be actually seeing more of that going forward on the Geekspeak as we have other people on the evangelism team here at Microsoft bring in folks, as they know, in the community for opportunities to get their brains picked by all our great Geekspeak attendees. So remember, this Geekspeak is driven by you, so make sure that you have questions about what you're seeing or anything about Workflow Foundation. Go ahead and use that questions and answers panel at the bottom and ask it, and we will ask the question of our expert on your behalf. So the next slide here is a little bit just of an intro into who Lynn and I are and a little bit of a background on us. And I love that your blog, by the way, is called Contagious Curiosity. I think that's great.
Thanks. Well, it got me where I am today because
yeah.
I'm just endlessly curious, and there's so much to know and so much to learn. I don't know if everybody saw, but we just released out a brand new kind of interesting search engine based on Silverlight. And I know we've been talking this quarter about Silverlight, so you're going to want to check that out. It's www.tafiti, TAFITI.com. It's just a very interesting implementation of a Silverlight application in the search engine. So check it out. That's what.
Yeah, I'm going to put a blog post on that a little bit later on, and also we've got links to our blogs later on in the slide deck. If you do the file print to PDF, you'll be able to see those. But we'll bring them up a little bit later in the Geekspeak. So let's go ahead and bring on our guest. This is actually his second Geekspeak, I think, or maybe his third. I'm not sure. We'll ask.
I think it's the third or fourth, actually.
It's your third, yeah. So Mark was kind of around at the beginning when we kicked off this Geekspeak idea about a year ago, and he's had opportunity to come on and speak to us about a couple of things. So, Mark, let's just have you share a little bit about what your expertise is and why you're so excited about .NET and MVP stuff, things like that.
Well, I've been a developer for almost my entire professional career. I worked in consulting companies, then got into training. And about 5 years ago, I founded Dunn Training and run that company based out of Atlanta. So we do consulting for mainly public sector, clients, state and local government, and then we do training classes all over the U.S. And workflow has been interesting to me since I'm sort of a biz talk geek as well. And
absolutely, I think that's what some of the previous Geekspeaks were on as well. So.
Right, Mark Berry and I did one on biz talk a while back. That was our last one.
Yep, and I remember seeing you did a code camp session recently on biz talk or workflow, I think, right?
I did one on workflow, yes.
Yep, I remember that. Super. Okay. Well, let's go ahead and move to our anchor slide, which just reminds everybody in the audience that they're free to ask questions as they like about the topics they're seeing or anything about, Workflow Foundation. So let's talk a little bit about, before we get into any kind of demo, what is it that's interesting about and worth people's whiles to learn about with rules and policies for Workflow Foundation?
Well, basically, the thing that I would point most people to when you start looking at architecting applications, we have all been taught and know that breaking the app into tiers is a good idea. So we do that so we can separate out things like data access logic into a data abstraction layer, and then we can move our business logic into a business layer. And normally, we start thinking about what a rule really is. There are different types of rules. You can have simple rules that, would be something like replacing an order does it really make sense that someone should have a quantity for that order of 0 or less than 0?
Yeah, and I think a lot of people, at least my first instinct, is to write some code. Check some comparison value and say if it's greater than 0 or less than 1, I guess, and throw some kind of exception.
Yeah, exactly. That's usually what happens. You write some if then else type logic. You're going to check the maybe quantity property of an object, and if it's not in the right range, you would throw an exception and then handle that. Well, as your code becomes more complex, you have these rules that get spread out all over the place. You may have some that are implemented in property procedures where you're checking in the setter whenever someone writes a value in. But, those are simple rules. You may have more complex rules that come into play. Once we start looking at systems like hotel reservations or going to the airport trying to get a flight, or maybe you have some sort of discount policy that you apply to customers. If they're a new customer, you may give them an initial discount, a fixed value of some sort. If they're ordering more than a certain quantity of product, you may apply, say, a 5 or 10% of that. Or you may look at them as being a certain level, say they're a gold, silver, or bronze customer. Based on that, you apply an additional discount to that. All of those will become rules, and if we implement that in code, we wind up having maybe a big switch, statement or a select case statement where we're going down and looking at the properties maybe for that order object to see, what level are they a new customer, et cetera, to compute what that discount would be. So then we get into more of a complex rule.
Hey, Mark, as you explain this, I'm just wondering if everybody listening knows all the prereqs and what they need to work with Workflow Foundation. Maybe you want to just address that for our listeners. Just talk to them about, now they're intrigued, they're understanding how it could be more efficient to write your business logic using Workflow. What do they need in terms of a dev environment to get started?
Oh, that's a great question, Lynn. And actually one thing I get a lot in training classes, I mentioned we deal a lot with public sector clients. A lot of them are still running the 1.1 framework.
Right.
And I'll often talk about workflow or WCF and how cool these things are. And they tell me, hey, I want to use that. Well, really the entry point is you have to have the 2.0 framework first. So you need to upgrade to Visual Studio 2005, have the 2.0 framework out there. And then you can download the .NET 3.0 framework, which actually gives you 4 things. You get Windows Presentation Foundation, Windows Communication Foundation, Card Space, and then along with that we get Windows Workflow Foundation as well. So you could think about that sort of grafting on top of the existing 2.0 framework and adding all the classes and support for these additional products.
Okay, great.
And the price is great too because it's basically free. As long as you've got 2005, you can download 3.0 and install it, and you're ready to go.
Do you think maybe you could open up the interface and just show us a little bit again what it looks like, not knowing what the experience level of the people listening in? And I'll remind the people listening in, the more questions that you ask, the better that Mark can tailor his presentation to what you're wanting to hear. If you're wanting sort of a general overview, you can actually just put that in the question manager and tell us. If you're wanting something specific answered, let us know that as well. So Mark, do you want to just do desktop sharing and maybe show us a bit about the interface to spark some questions?
You bet, Lynn. So I'm going in right now. Can you see my desktop okay?
I can. It looks great.
Sure can.
All right. Excellent, excellent. All right, I'm going to pull up Visual Studio right now, and you can see that basically I don't have a project or solution open. And once I install Windows Workflow, I'm going to get some project templates that are added in. So if I go to create a new project, notice that under Visual Basic, I have an entry down there for Workflow. And after you install the .NET 3.0 framework, you'll see this as well in your development environment. And let's just take a look at what goes along with that. Once I look at Workflow, I'm able to do a sequential workflow as a console application. I'm also able to build workflow libraries, and I really have two types of workflows, a sequential workflow and a state machine. Sequential workflows are great if I know that I've got a prescribed order of activities that are going to occur. State machine workflows are better when that order is not exactly known.
And you can apply rules and policies to either of those, right?
Yes, absolutely. So let's go ahead and just open up a sequential workflow as a console application. Console applications are great if I'm just trying to quickly demo something. And we'll take a look at what this environment looks like. Now, if you're a developer, this is sort of a different way of thinking. You're used to doing your control flow logic and code, and what you're about to see is a very graphical environment. If you're a BizTalk developer and you've built orchestrations before using that environment, and you've dealt with the rules engine that ships with BizTalk, then this should be very easy to learn. But what we start out with, you'll see that I've got a sequential workflow diagram here, and this looks very much like the beginnings of a flowchart, doesn't it? I've got a starting point and I've got an ending point. And as far as me defining the workflow, I'm simply going to drop something called an activity into this area and then sequentially build what I want it to do. So let me go over to my toolbox, and if I open up Windows Workflow, notice the toolbox is populated with a bunch of intrinsic activities that have already been built and shipped with the workflow product. And I've got things like if-else activities. I've got a code activity where I can just write whatever code I want to have execute. And I'll do something real simple just so we can see what this looks like. I start out by just grabbing an activity and dragging and dropping it. Notice the little green guy that pops up there. It's a green plus sign. That's showing me it's a valid place to drop an activity. So I'll just drop the code activity there. Since we're doing a quick demo, I'm not going to take the time to go into properties and name this, but it would be a good practice if you're working with workflow to give these things descriptive names. It just makes it a lot easier to read and deal with. So now you see a little red guy that pops up here in the upper right-hand corner. This is a validator, and it's basically telling me that I've got to do some configuration on the activity. So what I can do
basically
is...
you're not done yet.
Yeah, I'm not done yet. So if I go into Properties and move this over a little bit, you can see that Execute Code in the Properties window has a little red guy by it as well. And it's telling me in the tooltip that Execute Code is not set. And effectively what I'm doing with the code activity, I have an event for executing code, and it expects me to write some code in that event. So whenever this activity is evaluated, it will simply run that code. Also notice while I'm in Properties, these activities have enabled properties as well. You can disable and enable them in code or in the Properties window itself. So a quick and easy way to have it write that event handler for me is just double-clicking on this activity. And this is going to take me out of the visual view of the workflow and into the code that sits behind it.
Hey, Mark, so there's a couple of questions out here. Well, first, one of them is, can you use the express versions of C# and VB to build a workflow foundation solution?
I don't know the answer to that because I don't really run the express versions of any of the products, so I'm not certain if you can use the express versions or not.
All right, we'll take a note to confirm that. Just as a reminder to everybody who's listening, also the things that we're going to research later, any links that Mark mentions, anything that's relevant to the topics, we're going to collect all those together and post a follow-up post to our Geekspeak blog that has all those things together. So you can go there in a couple of days, and we'll have some good links for you.
All right. One thing I want to talk about before I actually get into to having this do something, since we're doing a demo, I'm going to define some properties here inside this workflow so we'll be able to see them. Normally how you would work with a workflow from another application is you would create a workflow library. So the workflow would compile into a DLL that you would reference. and then you would wind up passing an object reference into it. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And then the workflow could then deal with the object. So in this case, I'm going to define some properties here internally inside the workflow, just so we can see it and start to work with some rule conditions.
Hey, I'm just going to jump in. I just looked up whether workflow was supported in Visual Studio Express, and it is not. So that was a great question. So you do need the full version of Visual Studio.
All right, cool. So I'm just going to put a simple public field in here so we'll be able to see it, and maybe I'm just going to call it username. And should make that a string. And you guys notice I'm working in VB. Most all the examples and books and stuff you see are C#, but I'm a Visual Basic MVP.
Oh, there you go.
So I gotta support my language, man.
Absolutely.
All right. So inside here we might want to say prompt someone to give us a name and then actually store that value. So I could do something like a console right line. And I'm just going to grab it. And there I have it. All right, so now that we're able to grab some data and get that in, I'm going to go back to the designer. And you know how console apps work. As soon as it completes, it will end unless I stop it somehow.
Uh-huh.
So I'm just going to drop another code activity down here and maybe do something like a final console.readline. So it will have us, hit the enter key before we close out the console app. All right, now that we're getting some data in and we have a way to stop it, let's take a look at defining something called a rule condition. So you have all these different activities. Some of these can work with rules. One thing that we might want to deal with would be an if-else activity. Some others that support rules, we have a replicator and also a conditional activity group as well, or a conditioned activity group, which also support rules. And then a while activity as well if we want to do some looping. So we'll do some looping with this in just a moment too. But to start out, I'm just going to grab the if-else and drag and drop that over. Notice my green arrows that's showing me these are all valid places to drop this particular activity. And I'll just drop it down there. So now I've got an if-else activity. You can see that I've got different branches that I can run down. The validator is showing me that I've got to do something here. Right out of the box, I get 2 branches. If I wanted to add more than 2, I can just right-click on the if-else activity, and I get a pop-up with Add Branch. And it's very simple just to click that, and then I've got another branch. And I could keep doing that, to make this as complex as I wanted. So maybe in the if-else branch for the first area, we might want to set up a rule condition for this. So notice in the Properties window where I have this selected, I've got a condition property. And again, the red dot is indicating that I've got some more work to do before this activity is completely configured. Now if I hit the drop-down box, notice I've got 2 choices there. I can either set a code condition, which means that I could write a method that returned a Boolean value and basically have the condition call that method to get back true or false and make a decision of whether it should go down that path or not. Since we're talking about rules today, though, let's go ahead and set up a declarative rule condition for this. So once I check that off and I open this up, you can see that I need to give it a condition name. It basically doesn't know what rule we need to evaluate.
Hey, Mark, so what would be scenarios where you should stick with declarative versus writing your own code?
That's a good question. I think if you've got a complex system that you're setting up,
Mm-hmm.
and you've got a bazillion rules that you need to manage, then having some sort of a rules engine, is a great boon to you. If you're writing a simple program and you've just got some conditions you need to check to control the flow of things, you may not need something like a rules engine to do that. But it's important to look at it from, I guess, this perspective. Once we can sort of decouple the rules out of the code that we have, it's sort of the same benefit that we get with building interior systems, where we're pulling the management of something that may have to change apart, so that we're not building some sort of monolithic system where if a rule were to change, we've got to go in and basically dig through the code, find it, make the change. It could affect other rules somewhere else.
Yep, and it could introduce a bug.
Yeah, so changing that could introduce a bug. So once we get to the point of being able to decouple it, it just makes it a lot easier to manage. And that's one of the reasons why rules engines exist.
Sure. Okay.
All right. Great question, though, Glenn. So let's go ahead and look at the interface for setting up a condition here. If I hit this Browse button for this property, it's going to pull up a rule editor for a condition. And notice it's empty right now, so I can set up a group of rules if I want to and reuse them through other shapes or other activities. So this is a really cool interface. I love the fact that it supports IntelliSense. So, what I can start out with is looking at me, which is the current workflow. And when I hit the dot, I love this, guys. Good job, kudos to Microsoft. I can go down and look at all the properties that are visible, which one of them should be username, since we've made that public.
Ah.
Right. So notice I'm using VB syntax. I used me, which refers to the current object or class that I'm in. And I'm just going to set a condition and say if me.username is equal to Geekspeak. And watch what happens when I hit enter. Or not enter, but OK. I'm going to click OK. And check out the preview of the rule down at the bottom.
Yeah, that's funny. It changed it to this dot.
Yeah, that's right. It goes to a C# syntax at that point. So even though you may define these in Visual Basic, they will show up as C#, which I joke a lot that C# for me is a read-only language.
That's really interesting. I have never seen that before, because I've seen actually other IDE tools outside of ours that do translation. But this is the first time I've actually seen one of our tools do translation. That's very interesting.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So while we're talking about setting up these conditions, you've got different rule sort of operators, relational operators that you can set up. So you can do things like test for equivalency, if it's greater than, less than. You can do simple arithmetic operations on it, like plus, minus, division. You can do a modulus that supports mod. You've got logical operators, so you can handle looking at and, or, not. So that, you can't just write any .NET code you want in there, but, it's basically the things that you would want to set up to do some sort of conditional check.
Right.
So
now, it recognized username as a public property. Now, what if you had written, are you able to write a function somewhere and put the function in there equals Geekspeak?
Absolutely. I can check a function the same kind of way, as long as it's a method that's visible to it.
Right. So that may be a nice way to get sort of a hybrid declarative and code condition.
Right. And this brings up another important point about sort of later when we talk about forward chaining and how the rules engine works. These properties, become state for whatever object I'm dealing with.
Okay.
Right. So once I start having multiple rules that I want to evaluate, as part of the rule evaluation, eventually one rule may do something that changes the property of maybe a rule that preceded it. Some evaluation it was doing, and that may cause it to need to reevaluate that rule. And this is really how forward chaining works. If I have a group of rules, maybe 10 of them, and rule number 3 changes, the result of evaluating the rule changes the property value, and then rule number 5 later on does something that changes that property value as well. You could think of it as almost being marked as dirty. So the rules engine would then go back and reevaluate previous previous
I see.
rules that affect that property.
Do you have to be careful not to get into infinite loops and recursion and that sort of thing?
Yeah, I don't think you're really ever going to run into recursion. Eventually it will go through. It actually builds a graph and goes through all these rule evaluations. So you make certain that you're basically covered.
Yep.
Because of it will naturally or by default supports this forward chaining behavior.
Sure. And there's actually a question here from John. He says, what is the scope of a rules engine condition? Do all tasks in a workflow project live in the same class?
Well, they get compiled into the workflow. So if you're passing an object into it, and that object has public methods, those are visible to the workflow as it's evaluating these rules.
Okay, so username.
As long as it's public scope, you're good.
Right. So something else might be able to reference username from inside this workflow, or?
Yes, absolutely. Any other activity I have is able to see username without a problem.
Gotcha. Okay.
So this is also something I would sort of harp on as being very important. As you start building these rules, I would take the time to name them something descriptive. You certainly don't want to pull this editor up and see condition 1 through 100, and then try to figure out what that rule is doing.
Yeah, I'd be interested to do a poll on the attendees and see how many people have Form 1, Form 2, that stuff from the old VB days as part of their application. I used to do that all the time.
Me too, and I'm really bad about it when I get in a hurry and I'm trying to do a demo. I don't always name everything.
Yep. I think you're right. It's very important here because the rule itself is kind of self-documenting.
Right, exactly. So here I've checked to see if username is Geekspeak. Maybe we'll do a couple of others while we're in here, so we can use them later, and we may check to see if me.username is empty.
Empty string. Okay.
So I'm just checking an empty string. That's right.
Some people might come through and say, well, why aren't you using a switch statement or a case statement? But I guess.
Well, yeah, that's a good question. But here the idea here is we're trying to get these out of the code, right?
Sure. Right.
Right. We want to decouple it. So, and then since we've got 3 branches, let's do one more rule so we can tie these to all the branches, and do something like me.username. And maybe we'll check and see if it's not equal to Geekspeak. Now this also brings up another point. If I'm evaluating these rules, especially in something like an else if statement, do you think the order in which it looks at those is going to be important?
Yeah, I would think so.
So, imagine if I'm going to check and see if it's not equal to Geekspeak, then what if it's empty? If I check not equal to Geekspeak, empty is not equal to Geekspeak.
Sure, okay.
Right, so it's going to catch that. So you'd want to be careful about the order in which you evaluate these through an if-else statement, or else you might want to make sure you cover that with your rule definition. So I could come in and say it's not equal to that, and I want to make sure that me.username is not empty as well. So there I've covered it in the rules, so then the order is not going to be a big deal. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
All right. So now that I've got a few of these rules defined, I clicked OK too quick here, but maybe the first condition that I want to check is going to be is it equal to Geekspeak. So I'm just selecting that rule and applying it to this branch. And then I can do the same thing for the other branches if I want. And once I've got this set of rules declared, the editor will always give me the list. So whenever I hit browse like this, I can then check to see, maybe if it's something other than Geekspeak. And then in the third branch over here, we'll check and see if it's empty. And then notice for the branch, I've got the ability then to define other sequences once it drops down. So I can take other activities, drop them in here, and code those activities as well.
Wow, this is really a different way of writing business logic.
It is. It's a different way of thinking, isn't it?
Yeah. How long did it take you to be able to be productive with this, from when you first were introduced to workflow to when you were actually writing, production code? What was the curve for you?
Actually, I'm a bad candidate to ask that question because I've worked with BizTalk a lot.
Oh, okay. Okay.
And that made this somewhat easier for me to sort of grasp. I'm not sure. I think it would take a while. What I'd recommend for anybody learning workflow, there are a few really good books. A guy from Atlanta named Bruce Bukovitz wrote a book called Professional Workflow Foundation that's published by A Press. I would highly recommend just buying that book and working through it. And of course, just play with it. Get out there and write some stuff, and that's the best way to learn anything.
How about the code samples up on NetFX3? Have you worked with those at all?
Oh, yes. Those are absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, I thought they were pretty good myself, so we'll throw that link up there in the post-show references, too.
You got it.
All right, so I'm catching the fact that you entered Geekspeak there. Here I'm going to go in and say, something, just so we can see that it is really controlling which branch it runs down. I'll put you entered something else. And just so we can read our property and see what it is, maybe I'll throw up whatever you put in for username. And so we can go along with this and look at maybe handling some faults. In this other activity, maybe I want to throw an exception because let's say that it's not valid for you not to enter some data here. So I might do something like throw a new application exception and put something like username is required.
As you're typing along here, I see some questions are kind of piling up, so let's see if we can get some of these answered here. This is one you'll probably know. From John, who was the author of the book you just mentioned?
Bruce Bukovitz.
Bruce Bukovitz, okay, great.
Yep.
And then from Tom, what is a good starting point, webs and books? And we talked about that. We'll make sure and get those references up on the blog. Mm-hmm. And then from Andre, he has a question not about rules, rather roles. So we haven't really talked about roles at all here, have we?
No, and I'm not sure where he's going with it.
Yeah. So Andre, if you can restate your question, we'll get that one answered. And then we have one from Parimal.
That's a good one, actually, because it sort of leads to the foundation of what's going on under the covers with workflow.
Okay, let me just read that one to you so you know what it is. He says, what I mean to ask is the feature of workflow that after deployment, the end user can reorchestrate the flow by means of customization. The IT manager would like to trace down who did the change and that kind of stuff. So I think what he's asking is, after you've deployed, versioning on the workflow. Glenn, is that how you take that?
Yeah, that's what I was kind of thinking.
Okay,
Mm-hmm.
So the question mark is, from Parimal, is, okay, you've deployed this thing out into production, and now you have some change to it, business logic changes or something. How do you version it? What happens to the solution that's already been deployed? That's a pretty good question.
Yeah, it is a great question. So once you deploy it, you have some different options. You can actually set this up so it generates a separation of the workflow definition from the code that sits behind it. So you know how ASP.NET works, where we have the ASPX file, and then we've got a code file that sits behind that. So the workflow definition of what you're seeing visually here can be broken out into a XAML file. XAML being what we usually associate with WPF. It doesn't call it or name the extension XAML, but it names it XOML. And I hear some people refer to that as a XAML file. So it knows that when I open up a XAML file that's actually a workflow definition. Yeah. So you could go in and change some aspects of the activities through the XAML file if you wanted to. once it's in production, and then you could alter what it's doing there. In addition to that, once I start defining rules, the rules will get broken out into an XML file as well, and it'll have an extension of .rules. So I can also go in and tweak that later on if I want to as well.
And I think another option
actually we
as well
may be able to see that if we have time today too.
I think another option is to build XAML on the fly that represents the workflow, and you can pass that into the runtime dynamically.
Yeah. And there's a lot of stuff we can really do with rules because rules are basically read in from that rules file, and it generates a code DOM object for the rule internally. So it's actually possible. I haven't done this myself, but I've seen demos of it. You can dynamically generate rules on the fly while a workflow is running. Through a code DOM object, if you want.
Oh, that's cool. Did you see that in a webcast or a live presentation?
I actually saw that in a live presentation at a code camp that I attended.
Ah, darn. Okay, well, we'll have to search around because I'd love to see some presentation we can watch on that myself. So.
Well, actually, it's something I want to look into. So maybe later on down the road we can do a more advanced Geekspeak than this one.
Yeah. Okay, that's a great.
And I would love to show you how that works. Let's see, where were we? We were talking about exceptions. Now, this code activity is throwing a new application exception. So how would we normally handle that in our code? You'd wind up writing like a try block around code that you expect to have an error, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Right. So this is another, kind of different way of thinking. What I have to do here in a workflow, if you look at these tabs that I have down here below, this is letting me view the workflow definition. I also have a tab down at the bottom that lets me write a cancel handler. This might be cleanup that I want to do in case someone cancels the workflow running. But I also have fault handlers that I can define. So if I click on that tab, I can go over to my toolbox, and I've got a fault handler activity, and I can drag and drop many of these if I want to into this area that you're seeing me highlight with my mouse. And this is effectively like you writing a try-throw catch. So each of these fault handlers that you drop over would wind up being a catch. So I'm just going to drop one real quick and put a code activity down here. And we'll say in the code activity, we'll do a console.writeLine. And just let you know that the username is required. So we've caught it. Now in the absence of a fault handler like this, of course it would crash. We write error handlers so we can gracefully recover from bad things happening, right? Now notice I need to set the fault type. If I go into the properties for that fault handler, you'll see that I've got a red dot there.
Mm-hmm.
So what I really need to do is come over and tell it what exception are you trying to catch. And up here in the name, I'm just going to tell it I threw a application exception, didn't I? So I'm going to tell it to catch the application exception. And then we have a simple error handler wrapped around what we're doing in our workflow. So I think that's good enough for us to actually see it do something.
There's a question out here. Is there an equivalent for finally, or do we not need to worry about that?
Well, you could almost think about the cancel activity as sort of being a finally, but yeah, you could basically put in just the generic system.exception as a fault handler, right? And then if we wind up catching something, something happens, that would wind up running. All right, so let's go ahead and enter a name. If we put in Geekspeak, I may not have written a console write line for that one.
As you're doing that, I'll just thank Pal for his comment here. He's saying, I've had experiences where changing the XAML for persisted WF will tank once rehydrated. So it looks like you'll have to do some testing if you're going to do dynamic XAML and versioning, just from the real world. So Pal, thanks for that. We really appreciate it.
Right. So I'm not getting it doing what I want. So let me look at it one more time.
Yeah, no problem. Well, it's no easy.
Good way to highlight debugging, by the way.
Yeah, to answer questions, write live demos, and manage all of it at once. So take your time, no problem. As you're doing that, I see a question here from Andre. Could WebF be applied to web applications? And I think actually Glenn or I can take that one. Glenn, do you want to just answer that?
Yeah, I absolutely can.
Maybe give an example.
Yeah, there's a couple of scenarios. I mean, within a web application, you can certainly receive, you can kick off a workflow, right? So the workflow, once it's built, is just a class, so that you can certainly launch a workflow from there. But another way that Workflow Foundation is used in ASP.NET is to build a UI that normally when people build a web UI, they'll put code in a button that says when the button's clicked, show to this page or go to this page and so on. So in fact, a lot of best practices for using Workflow Foundation to build sort of the wizard metaphor for web applications, build your UI flow.
And in fact, I'll jump in too, and some of our attendees might be working with SharePoint, which is basically just a type of an ASP.NET website. And of course, there's extensive workflow already built into SharePoint, and it can be also customized, which is kind of its own little separate topic that I've actually done a series of webcasts on. But you know, some people might be interested, and so really the short answer is yes, and extensively. And there's just a lot of use for workflow in all types of applications, including web applications. Mark, are you still debugging, or where are we at here?
No, I think I got it.
Okay.
I'm not sure exactly why it didn't show anything like
Go ahead.
but what I just did, which is interesting, notice that graphically I can right-click on this and I can insert a breakpoint on an activity. I can stop it and step into that activity once the breakpoint is reached.
Cool, and I see Pal jumping in again. Appreciate it. He's saying to support what we've just been talking about in terms of integration, that he's written a complete enterprise form system incorporating WebApp to handle the forms and routing, everything based on web. So he's used it as well. So great.
All right. Why we didn't see it pop up earlier is my rule. I was checking for Geekspeak with a lowercase s rather than uppercase s. So you can see that we entered Geekspeak. And before, while we were chatting, I ran it and entered something else. So let's go ahead and see if our error handler, if our fault handler is going to catch the fact that we entered just something empty. And you can see the username is required. Now I'm saying this because I'm running it in the Visual Studio environment. If this were compiled and I were running it, you of course wouldn't get this popping up anywhere. Right. And I'll go ahead and click Continue. And you know what? This ended because, I'm glad this happened. This ended because we were doing a read line down here to stop it. But once the fault was raised and it caught it, it didn't come back to this, right? So what I would need to do, so we can actually see the error message pop up, is come out here to the fault handler and do another read line after I display that message. Does that make sense?
It does. I think it's sometimes better to see in demos when things don't go right because you actually learn more from it. So keep on going.
Yeah, in fact, I was telling Glenn last night, I came up to Chattanooga to do a user group talk. And I'd spent, a lot of time over the weekend writing these demos and putting together a slide deck with all sorts of fancy animations. And I got up here about 4 o'clock and checked into the hotel, and then realized I'd left all of that on a jump drive back at my house.
Oh, no.
Yeah. So basically I had to do the user group talk and do all this stuff on the fly, sort of like what we're doing here. But actually here you can see that the fault caught the fact that we entered a blank username. So our error handling mechanism is working like we want it to.
Super.
All right, I know we're running a little tight on time here. I wanted to talk about policies a little bit too.
Well, there's one question from John that's relevant to what you just showed, though. He says, can you force a reentry into the workflow once you've reached the fault handler?
Yes, I can have that go back and re-enter the workflow if I want to, because that information is going to be communicated back to the host that's running the workflow. So it's no problem to recall the workflow, resend an object back through it if I need to have it be reevaluated.
Cool.
All right. Let's talk a little bit about policies. What we've seen so far is setting up rules that are going to apply to the types of controls like looping, if then else. You may also want to, at some point, set one up that is a collection of rules, and that's really how I would define a policy. A policy is going to be a collection of rules that I use throughout my workflow. And in order to do that, we actually have a policy activity that you see right here. I can grab a policy and drop that into a workflow somewhere if I want to. And then in order to configure it, a policy expects you to reference a rule set. I don't have a set of rules right now, but I could come in and start creating a new set of rules anytime I want. And notice this dialog is a little more complex than the one that we saw before for management policy. So in fact, what I want to do is add a rule, give that rule a name, and let's just imagine that we're checking a inventory level or something. And in fact, I would need some kind of a property that I can see to do that. I'll add that in later. But the way this definition works, it's basically like an if-then-else statement. So I can look at, this dot, and you can see username still right now, but imagine we've got something like a quantity in there. And of course, I can't see it, so let me go add one in real fast.
Okay.
So I'm just throwing in a quantity and a discount as public fields. So then I can begin to write a rule, and maybe if I want to say me dot quantity is greater than 20, if I order more than 20 items, then I'm going to set me dot discount
Now again, this interface is generating XML code that can be versioned, to speak to our earlier comment about versioning, right?
Yes, we'll jump out in a moment and take a look at the XML file that this generates. So I could set the discount equal to something like, 20% would be too generous. We'll wind up giving it 10%. And then I've got else actions that I can do as well if I want.
Before you jump off of there, can you mention what the chaining means, the full chaining up in the top?
Certainly. What we were talking about before, when I've got multiple rules, where one rule may change a property that another rule is depending on, I would look at that as a dependency between the rules. So the fact that later on I've evaluated a rule that made a change means that I want the rules engine to go back and reevaluate that earlier rule.
I see. What are the other options there?
All right, excellent question. So aside from full chaining, I've got 3 options. And let me see why that's giving me an error.
Oh, it's a cast error.
Yeah, it's a cast error. So
it's like working in the SSIS designer where you have validation, which is sometimes a little bit irritating.
Yeah, actually I'm just going to give it a number so I can, I can get through it. All right, so I'll pop this down now that we've got the casting thing out of the way. you can see that I've got sequential. This basically means it's going to sequentially evaluate rules and zip right through them top to bottom. There won't be any chaining that goes on. I also have the ability to explicitly update only. So this means that I'm calling an update function, maybe on a property or a method, and I'm telling the rules engine that I want you to reevaluate only if I've explicitly let you know that this method or property change has caused something that needs to be reevaluated.
I see.
And then full chaining is probably what I would recommend most people do, which is just it's going to automatically check it if it knows that a public property has changed. Now, if you're doing something through a method, it's not aware of that potentially. You've got a set of what do we call them? Attributes. Sorry, I had a brain malfunction there for a minute. But you know when you write something like a web service, you have to use an attribute on a method to let it know that this is a web method. In the rules engine, you also have a set of attributes that you can apply to let it know that maybe you've made a change. There's a rule write attribute that you can apply that tells it this is basically a dirty rule.
I see.
Or this rule has done something to make the data dirty and it needs to be reevaluated. So you have explicit control over it. You have basically what we would consider automatic with full chaining, and then sequential you could think of as turning the chaining off.
Great. Thank you.
All right, let's talk about the order in which these rules get evaluated as well. I know we're down to like 6 minutes here, so I'll try to be quick. You have a priority setting here. This number, the higher you make the number, that rule will be evaluated first. So priority is really how you control which rules get evaluated in what order. By default, they're all zeros, so the chaining will take effect as it detects the dependencies between them. By default, it evaluates them based on their name. So they're in alphabetical order as far as evaluation occurs. But you can control that through the priority setting for the rule. And then individually, you can tell the rule if you want it to reevaluate or not reevaluate. Right. All right, I know we've only got about 5 more minutes left, so I wanted to make sure I had time to answer some questions before we get wrapped up. Is there anything in the queue that we haven't addressed yet?
Well, Andre's been asking a series of questions that I've been kind of answering to the side, but maybe since we have a couple of minutes. He's wondering about integration with user interfaces with workflow. His questions have been around integration of forms to allow input into workflow values, and I've been talking with him about InfoPath and ASP.NET. He's really wanting to know, just sort of from a high level, how you connect some sort of user interface to a workflow to be able to plug in values. So maybe you could just talk about that.
Oh, right. You can actually build a workflow designer into a Windows application if you want to. And that's one of the things that Bruce Bukovic covers in the book that I was talking about. It's not actually a trivial thing to do. You basically have to draw the interface for managing the workflow. But once you did that, you could then allow users to change the workflow. You can have a toolbox with activities. You could set up a properties window, and you ultimately have control over it. You could elect to show or not show whatever activities you wish, or you let them not change the workflow by dragging and dropping activities. You could elect only to let them change property values for them if you wanted to. But that's a great question and certainly something that's possible.
Great. Any other thoughts that you want to share with the listeners just based on your experience working with workflow? Any best practices, lessons learned the hard way, things that you wish someone would have told you?
Well, yeah, the big thing is I would say get in the habit of naming things so you can look at it visually and know what they're doing. Especially when it comes to groups of rules, I would highly recommend making certain that you name things so you can get it, see it immediately.
Okay, great.
Also, you had asked earlier about the rules file. If you look in the Solution Explorer, I've just told it to display all files.
Ah.
Can you see that there's a .rules file down there?
Yep.
And if I double-click on that, you'll see that this is actually XML. And this will contain the rules that we have been working with.
So this could be updated outside of a code development activity, right?
Yeah, I could do something external, and then read the rules back in. That these are all parsed in and built into code.object internally.
Gotcha.
Before the rules get evaluated. And you're not actually seeing the XAML file, but let me save this one off, and I'm going to start another one and do code separation with it, just so you can see what that looks like. So we'll just quickly do another console application. And I'm going to actually delete my workflow out and then add an item. And notice I have an item that's a sequential workflow with code separation.
I see. So that's kind of like ASP.NET with the code behind.
Exactly. That's the way I would look at it. And now I still have my workflow, but it's built a XAML file. And if I show all files, you'll see that this really has a code behind file that's behind it. And that's where all my logic is going to go. So the XAML file is just an XML file. It's actually the same schema that you have for XAML if you're working with WPF apps.
Gotcha. I always tell people that you have the XAML and the XAML, and that's very Dr. Seuss approach to development. Well, that's fantastic. Well, Mark, we're going to jump back to our slide deck, and we're going to go on to our resources slide. Got some good links in here, basically to the homepage for our Geekspeak, which is the blog. That's where we put articles that announce upcoming Geekspeaks, as well as articles that are links of references based on what we covered. So we'll put a post there in a couple of days with all the links about Workflow Foundation based on what we talked about.
Yeah, and I'm just going to jump in because I do a lot of the guest scheduling to let our listeners know that we're going to be posting up the schedule for both September and October there shortly.
That's right. And we also have the shows posted on Channel 9, which is another way to get the recordings. My blog is in here as well as Lynn's blog, so you can check those out, and Mark's website at dunntraining.com. You've got a Silverlight class that is just phenomenal. I think you guys are getting ready to kick off, right?
Yeah, we've actually already kicked it off. We're running it. We ran sort of a beta that included, I think, 20 or so people from the Microsoft evangelism team.
Yeah.
And the feedback was tremendous from that.
Yeah, we loved it.
An MVP wrote the class, and we're running it publicly in September in Atlanta. And we have a tour that we're running as well. If you want to look on the web, the tour information is at www.silverlight-tour.com.
Yeah, I'll be posting the link up on my blog as well for that.
And actually, if I just pulled up Bruce's book on Amazon, do I need to share my desktop again?
No, we'll add that to the link so people can download that.
All right, very good. I highly recommend that book. Bruce is a good guy, and he did a fabulous job covering the ins and outs of workflow. Fantastic.
So thanks for all the good demos here and good questions, good answers to the questions that we had, Mark, and thanks for coming on. And Lynn, as always, it was a fun time co-presenting with you. And at this point, I think we'll wrap it up and toss it back over to Tracy to do a little final information there.
All right, well, thank you, Glenn. It's always a pleasure to get to come on.
Thanks,
no
Mark.
problem.
Great, and with that I do want to remind everybody that for more information you can print the PDF of today's session. To do that you want to just go to the file in your upper navigation bar. You can also continue to submit your questions into that Q&A panel. You just want to type them in and hit the Ask button. And I'm going to be posting a survey here in just a minute. If you would all please take a moment to fill that out before you log off. We really do appreciate your feedback. Now, as a reminder for upcoming and previously recorded webcasts, you can visit microsoft.com/webcast. You'll go here to access this webcast, which will be available for download in about 24 hours. Also, if you have any webcast content ideas, something out there you'd like to see and haven't yet, we'd love to hear from you. Just take note of this link here. And here is a survey from our session today. Please follow the link provided to complete today's webcast evaluation. And with that, I do want to extend a very special thank you to Glenn, Lynn, and Mark for your presentation today and answering all the great questions we had come through the queue. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this is going to conclude today's session. I want to thank you again for joining us. You may now disconnect from the audio portion of today's presentation.